After years of silence, Prince Edward has finally broken his reserve and spoken out about the endless rumors surrounding Princess Diana. His words, quiet yet piercing, carry the weight of someone who has long observed the turbulence from the sidelines but chose never to intervene. Until now. For decades, Diana's story has been entangled in whispers of betrayal, grief, and the unseen struggles she endured within the gilded cage of royalty. Many thought Edward, known for his discretion and distance from the spotlight, would never address the subject. But his sudden decision to speak has not only reignited old questions about Diana's life and untimely death, but also shaken the very core of the monarchy itself. What makes this revelation even more explosive is its impact on King Charles, the monarch, who has spent years trying to stabilize his reign and redefine his image in the eyes of the public, has been left devastated by his brother's words. It is one thing to face the judgment of the media or the speculation of biographers, but quite another when the criticism comes from within the royal family itself. Edward's confession does not simply reopen old wounds, it deepens them, drawing painful attention back to Diana's shadow that still lingers over the House of Windsor. This moment marks a turning point, not only in how the public perceives the monarchy, but also in how the family confronts its past. Prince Edward's voice, calm but unwavering, has brought back a storm the palace had hoped would remain buried. And for King Charles, it may prove to be one of the greatest emotional blows of his reign. Edward and Diana's bond. Prince Edward and Princess Diana were rarely seen together in public. Photos of them side by side were rare, and the press hardly paid attention. Yet behind the scenes, a gentle connection formed between them. A bond so natural it didn't need words to prove it was real. While many in the royal family kept their distance from Diana, Edward was different. He didn't ignore her, correct her, or treat her with cold formality. Instead, he listened. In a palace where politeness often replaced genuine warmth, Edward offered something rare, kindness that was calm, honest, and not performed for the cameras. During Diana's most difficult moments, Edward was one of the few who would simply ask, "Are you okay?" In a world built on titles and duties, those few words reminded her she was a person, not just a princess. His presence made her feel safe in a place that often felt heavy and unwelcoming. Edward's kindness wasn't loud or showy. It came in quiet gestures, standing when she entered a room, moving toward her so she felt seen, offering a smile or a nod of silent support. These small actions spoke louder than speeches, showing the deep respect he had for her, bro. There are whispers that Diana once wrote letters to a friend mentioning Edward by name. She said he understood her in a way no one else did, not even Charles. Their connection wasn't about secret meetings or long, hidden talks. It lived in the small moments. A glance across a crowded room, a quiet reassurance, the unspoken reminder that she wasn't alone. Some within the family noticed their quiet bond. It's said that Charles once confronted Edward during a gathering, accusing him of siding with Diana and ignoring the harm she was causing the family's image. Edward didn't argue. He simply left the room. His silence wasn't weakness. It was his way of making it clear where he stood without raising his voice. Over the years, their bond stayed strong. They didn't need constant contact or promises in writing. What mattered was that Diana knew there was one person in the family who saw her struggles without judging her. Edward watched as the royal system slowly pushed Diana to the sidelines, her open heart clashing with the rigid rules around her. He never tried to change the system, but he saw everything. The weight she carried, the pain she hid behind her bright smile. His quiet support became a hidden comfort, a reminder she wasn't completely alone within palace walls. As time went on, what Edward witnessed stayed with him. He saw the truth behind the royal image, the pain that titles and traditions couldn't cover. In his quiet way, he came to understand the life Diana truly lived, and it changed the way he saw the family forever. But why did Prince Edward stand firmly by Diana's side even when the rest of his family turned against her. What hidden truth lies behind this loyalty? Let's find out. Having seen my family and the institution's part in constantly feeding the British press with lies, mistruths, the reason behind Edward's loyalty, Prince Edward was known for being quiet during his years at Buckingham Palace. Unlike his older brothers, Charles and Andrew, who were often in the spotlight, Edward never went looking for attention. He preferred to stay in the background, observing everything and keeping family matters to himself. This quiet role gave him a clearer understanding of the royal family's struggles than most people had. Edward noticed things about Princess Diana that others didn't. He admired the way she cared for orphans, worked tirelessly for her charities, and stayed strong despite the constant media attention. While many in the royal family judged her, Edward quietly respected her courage. Still, he kept his true feelings hidden. The press sometimes called him the Invisible Prince because of how rarely he appeared in public. But avoiding attention wasn't just about staying out of the news. Edward was protecting something deeply personal. He had liked Diana since they were young. They first met when Diana was only 13, often crossing paths at royal events. Over the years, his feelings for her grew stronger. A few people in the palace noticed the way he would watch her when she entered her room, but Edward never spoke of it. When Charles and Diana's relationship became public, Edward felt as though a door had quietly closed. He had always feared the day they would announce their engagement, and when it happened, it hurt more than he had imagined. Watching her walk down the aisle in a beautiful white gown to marry Charles in 1981 filled him with silent sadness. Still, he accepted it in his usual quiet way. As time went on, Edward buried his feelings and focused on his royal duties. He saw how Diana struggled with the pressures of being a princess, and though he sometimes wanted to reach out to comfort her, he held back. He believed it wasn't his place. In 1981, when Edward was 17, he stood in St. Paul's Cathedral, watching his brother marry Diana. Most people saw a typical young prince, but those who looked closer noticed something more complicated in his eyes, something beyond happiness. Some even whispered about jealousy, but the truth was deeper. Diana was just 20, thrown into the harsh world of royal life, and Edward understood how difficult it was for her. Although their connection was not obvious to others, after all, she was destined to be queen while he was the youngest son. When they were alone, there was an unspoken bond between them. Edward never judged her or demanded perfection. Instead, he offered quiet support, always careful not to reveal how much she meant to him. People close to the family noticed how at gatherings he would position himself where he could see her. To Edward, Diana was unlike anyone else. Compared to the cold formality of the royal family, she was warm, genuine, and full of life. But she was his brother's wife, and he could never cross that line. He saw the cracks in their marriage long before others did, and it pained him to watch her suffer without being able to help. Bound by duty and the strict rules of royal behavior, Edward hid his feelings behind polite smiles and proper manners. Outwardly, he seemed like a kind, well-mannered prince. But inside, he carried the quiet ache of loving someone he could never have. People assumed he would one day find a bride, but Edward knew that no one could replace the woman who had left such a lasting mark on his heart. But beyond all this, did Edward quietly watch Diana's every move? Let's take a closer look. He was shouting at me. I was shouting back at him. It wasn't nice. It wasn't pleasant at all. And he snapped and he pushed me to the floor. I don't think that we can ever have peace with my family unless the truth is out there. Edward's observation amidst royal drama. The British royal family had always been known for their polished image. In public, they appeared calm, dignified, and unshakable. Inside the palace, strict traditions ruled, and nothing personal was ever revealed to the outside world. For years, this calm and controlled image protected their reputation, leaving little room for public doubt or questions. But everything changed when Diana arrived. At first, her presence brought excitement. She was young, and full of life. Her smile could light up any room, and cameras loved her. To the public, she was the picture of a fairy tale princess, beautiful, happy, and living a dream. But behind the palace walls, the reality was far from perfect, and Prince Edward quietly saw it all. Unlike his brothers, Charles and Andrew, Edward avoided the spotlight. He stayed in the background, quietly watching. This gave him a clear view of the struggles others ignored. While the world saw Diana smiling in elegant dresses, Edward noticed the moments when her smile faded too quickly. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, the effort she put into looking cheerful for the cameras, and the loneliness she hid from the public. The palace was a world of endless rules and cold traditions, a difficult place for someone as open-hearted as Diana. She wanted to show love freely and express her emotions, but the royal system was not built for that. Edward could see her struggling to fit in, her honesty clashing with the family's rigid ways. He noticed how people's behavior shifted when Diana walked into a room. Sometimes she lit up the atmosphere. Other times, conversations would stop and invitations would be quietly withdrawn. More often than not, she found herself alone. Edward never turned away from her pain or spoke against her. Instead, he offered silent support, always in the background. There was a story whispered in royal circles about a note Edward sent Diana during one of her hardest times. It was simple, kind, and without judgment, just a reminder that someone cared. For Diana, who often felt isolated, that small gesture meant everything. As her marriage to Charles began to crumble and the media pressure grew, Edward stayed silent. He didn't take sides or seek attention. He just kept watching, listening, and remembering. Many believed his silence came from grief, a quiet sorrow for someone he felt had been deeply hurt and misunderstood. When news of Diana's tragic car crash spread, the palace fell into a heavy silence. But according to those close to the family, Edward didn't wait for official statements. He quietly traveled to Paris to see her one last time before she was brought home. The palace never confirmed this, but those who knew him believed it was true. It wasn't about public image. It was deeply personal. In the years that followed, Edward became even more reserved. He avoided events where Diana's name would be brought up and kept his distance from Camilla at family gatherings. Not out of anger, but as a silent protest. It was as if he couldn't fully accept Charles's new marriage, still feeling the loss of Diana's absence. One moment that stayed in people's minds happened at Charles and Camilla's wedding. Edward kept a low profile as usual, but when it came time to sign the guest book, he reportedly wrote, "May your happiness not come at the cost of others." For most, it seemed harmless, but those who knew the history understood the weight behind those words. They were for Diana. The message was never discussed openly, but its meaning lingered quietly in the background. While all this was happening, Edward was still figuring out his own path in life. In 1981, when Diana married Charles, Edward chose not to follow his brothers into the military. Instead, he pursued the arts and creative projects, balancing royal duties with life beyond the palace walls. He saw how Diana was changing the royal family from within. She didn't just wave from balconies. She hugged sick children, spoke openly about her struggles, and drew attention to issues the royals had long ignored. One of her most powerful moments was when she hugged a child with AIDS, breaking the stigma at a time when such gestures were rare. For her, kindness came before protocol, and Edward never forgot that. But why did Edward decide to stay quiet for such a long time? Let's find out. The tradition that silenced Edward. For generations, the British royal family lived by one unspoken rule: never complain, never explain. It was more than just a saying, it was their shield, a way to protect themselves from public chaos. No matter what storms brewed behind palace walls, they smiled, waved to the crowds, and carried on as if nothing was wrong. Feelings were hidden, problems dealt with in private, Then came Diana, and everything changed. Diana was not trained to hide her emotions behind centuries-old traditions. She felt things deeply and spoke openly, even when it made others uncomfortable. She cried in public when she was overwhelmed, admitted to feeling lonely, and refused to pretend that everything was perfect when it wasn't. People loved her for it. To them, she was not just a princess, she was human, someone with real struggles they could understand. But inside the palace, her honesty was seen as risky. Each time she spoke her truth, she pulled back the curtain on the royal family's carefully guarded world. Prince Edward, quiet and observant, noticed everything. He saw the discomfort in the room when Diana spoke from the heart, and the way some family members kept their distance from her instead of confronting her. Deep down, Edward understood. Diana was not trying to damage the family. She was just trying to survive in a place where silence was valued more than truth. Edward stayed loyal and silent, but that didn't mean he missed what was happening. He saw how Diana's openness touched people in a way royal tradition never could. The public's love for her began to outshine the monarchy's centuries-old image. She didn't just wave from balconies. She knelt to greet children, held the hands of the sick, and comforted those in pain. Everywhere she went, she brought warmth, and people adored her for it. Yet, this growing popularity caused tension. The royal family had always moved as one, avoiding letting any single person stand out too much. But Diana's star kept rising. Her openness didn't fit the controlled, polished image the royals had worked so hard to maintain. Edward watched the family cling to tradition while Diana changed everything simply by being herself. To many in the palace, she was unpredictable. To Edward, she was life breathed into an old system. Her compassion and honesty became her defining traits, making the royal family seem more human, but also making their old ways look outdated. Edward saw clearly if the monarchy didn't adapt, it would lose touch with the people it was meant to serve. When Diana passed away too soon, it was more than a personal loss. It was a turning point in history. The public no longer wanted distant royals. They wanted someone real, and Diana had shown them what that looked like. Edward carried these truths silently for years. He had seen how Diana's openness brought change the palace couldn't undo. Eventually, he shared his thoughts quietly with someone he trusted. His words were simple, unpolished, but powerful. He confirmed what many had long believed, that Diana had been misunderstood and mistreated by the very system meant to protect her. Edward's quiet admission changed the way people talked about the royal family. It cracked open a door that had been shut for decades. His silence had protected him, but it had also hidden a truth too heavy to keep alone. He knew that sometimes silence doesn't shield. It hides pain that needs to be seen. While the world had loved Diana for her honesty, Edward's acknowledgement proved that even inside the palace, there were those who saw and understood her struggle. His loyalty didn't blind him. He saw the gap between tradition and the public's longing for connection. Edward's soft-spoken honesty, even years later, showed that real change can start with the smallest whisper. So, how did King Charles respond to Prince Edward's confession? Let's uncover the truth. King Charles's reaction. For most of his life, King Charles had lived inside the unshakable walls of royal tradition. Those walls were not made of stone, but of rules, expectations, and the teachings drilled into him since he was a boy. In that world, emotions were hidden behind carefully practiced smiles. The public saw the polished surface, the waves to the crowds, the formal speeches, the glittering ceremonies, while the struggles, the tears, and the private storms stayed locked away behind closed palace doors. To Charles Bao, this wasn't just a habit, it was duty. It was his way of protecting the monarchy's image, of keeping the royal ship steady no matter how wild the seas became. But then one day, his younger brother, Prince Edward, broke the silence. Edward had always been the quiet one in the family. While others spoke, he listened. While others rushed to take center stage, he stayed in the background, watching and thinking. He rarely shared what was on his mind, but when he finally chose to speak, his words carried a weight that no one could ignore. And this time, Edward spoke of Diana. Diana, once the bright star beside Charlesville, a woman who could light up a room with her presence, who reached out to strangers with warmth, who smiled even when she was hurting inside. She had shown the public a side of royalty that many had never seen before, a human side. She had broken through the silence and brought the monarchy closer to the people in a way that frightened some but inspired millions. He spoke of a truth he had kept locked away for years, that Diana, despite her flaws and mistakes, had deserved kindness, support, and love from those around her. Instead, she had been left to face a lonely struggle within the palace walls. When Charles heard this, something shifted inside him. Edward's words didn't come like a sword, sharp and cutting, but like a mirror, quietly reflecting a truth Charles had tried not to see. Suddenly, memories he had buried under royal responsibilities began to surface. He remembered standing beside Diana in front of cheering crowds, the flash of cameras blinding them both. Their smiles had been perfect, but their hearts were far apart. He remembered her tears hidden from the world, but visible to him in rare, unguarded moments. He remembered the arguments, the cold silences, and the invisible walls that had slowly risen between them. Hearing Edward speak with such clarity forced Charles to imagine what might have been, if only the family had listened more and judged less. If only they had shown her the warmth she needed instead of retreating behind protocol. If only they had opened doors instead of closing them. He did not respond with anger. Instead, he grew quiet. That evening, Charles sat alone in his study, staring out at the palace gardens. He thought about the young woman he had first met, a Diana full of laughter, hope, and a spark that could brighten the darkest day. He thought about how that spark had faded under the weight of endless rules and the suffocating silence of royal life. Edward's words stayed with him like a whisper he couldn't forget. They reminded him that he had once stood beside Diana, but had not always stood with her. It wasn't just a king who sat in that study. It was a man remembering the woman he had loved and lost in the most public way possible. He knew Edward hadn't spoken to hurt him, but to shed light on a truth the family had long tried to keep in the shadows. Diana had been a gift to the world, even if she had been a challenge to royal ways. She had reminded everyone inside and outside the palace that titles and crowns did not erase humanity, that feelings mattered, that love mattered. Charles remembered the way she hugged strangers without hesitation, how she held the hands of those in pain, how she spoke openly about her struggles when it would have been easier to hide them. She had filled cold, formal spaces with warmth and compassion. As the night deepened, Charles realized Edward's confession wasn't only about Diana. It was about the family's inability to adapt, to evolve, to open themselves to the kind of human connection the modern world longed for. Diana had shown them that being royal was more than wearing crowns and upholding tradition. It was about serving people with empathy and truth. Edward's words reignited promises Charles had made to himself after Diana's death. To do better, to listen more, to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. He thought of his children, of the younger generation of royals who were now finding their own voices. He saw in them a reflection of Diana's courage, their willingness to speak honestly about challenges, to reach out to people in ways that would have made her proud. And in that moment, Charles understood something deeply. Silence was not always strength. Sometimes the softest words could carry the most powerful change. He did not rush to issue statements or call for meetings. Instead, he sat with the truth. He let it move through him, teaching him again that tradition should never come at the cost of kindness. In the days that followed, those close to him noticed a difference. He listened more. His tone softened. His moments of reflection grew longer. And though he did not speak publicly about Edward's confession, its echo lingered in everything he did. He saw now that Edward's words were not an attack on the crown, but an invitation to embrace truth and humanity.